Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here coming to you from Colorado. Today we're talking about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention, Russia's shadow fleet. For those of you who haven't been following this, the US Navy just seized a Russian tanker, and this is part of a much larger story about how Russia has been evading Western sanctions and how that system is starting to crack. The question is simple. What happens to Russia's war machine if they lose their ability to sell oil on the black market? Let me give you the background. When the West imposed sanctions on Russian oil after the Ukraine invasion, Russia didn't just accept defeat. They assembled what's called a shadow fleet, somewhere between 600 and 800 old tankers that operate outside the Western financial system. These ships change flags constantly, turn off their transponders, do ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the ocean, all to get Russian crude to buyers who don't care about sanctions. It's been remarkably effective. Russia has kept selling oil this entire time. Here's how it works. A shadow tanker picks up crude at a Russian port, sails to some point in the ocean, transfers its cargo to another vessel, and that vessel delivers to India or China or whoever's buying. The paperwork gets falsified along the way, insurance is sketchy or non-existent, and everyone pretends not to notice. Russia gets its money, buyers get discounted oil, and Western sanctions look like a joke. That's been the status quo for almost 3 years now. But things are changing. The United States has started actively hunting these vessels. The Navy seized a tanker last week, and there are reports of more operations planned. The U.S. is also pressuring countries that provide flags of convenience, places like Gabon, Cameroon, Palau, to stop registering these ships. When you combine that with increased insurance scrutiny and port restrictions, suddenly the shadow fleet doesn't look so invincible anymore. Why does this matter? Russian oil revenue funds somewhere between 40% and 50% of the war in Ukraine. Every barrel that doesn't get sold is money that doesn't go to missiles and tanks. The shadow fleet has been Russia's lifeline, the thing that's allowed Putin to keep fighting despite unprecedented sanctions. If that lifeline gets cut, Russia doesn't have a backup plan. They can't just build new tankers overnight, and legitimate shipping companies won't touch Russian crude. Now let's talk about the tankers themselves, because this is actually terrifying. Most of these ships are ancient, 15 to 20 years old minimum, some even older. They're operating without proper insurance, without proper maintenance, often with crews that are undertrained. These are floating environmental disasters waiting to happen. We've already seen several close calls in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. It's only a matter of time before one of these things breaks apart and dumps its cargo into the ocean. The buyers are a problem too. India and China have been happily purchasing Russian crude at steep discounts, sometimes 30% below market price. That's great for them, but it's kept Russia afloat. The question is, what happens as the shadow fleet shrinks? Do India and China accept higher prices and more risk? Do they start looking for alternative suppliers? Neither country wants to directly confront the US over this, but they also really like cheap oil. Here's my read on where this goes. Over the next 6 months, expect the U.S. to significantly escalate pressure on the shadow fleet. More seizures, more sanctions on supporting entities, more pressure on flag states. Russia will lose maybe 10 to 20% of its shadow capacity in that time frame. That's not enough to collapse the Russian war effort, but it's enough to hurt. Budget deficits will grow, military procurement will slow, and Putin will have fewer options. The wild card is China. If Beijing decides that cheap Russian oil isn't worth the hassle of American scrutiny, Russia is in serious trouble. China has been the biggest enabler of sanctions evasion, not just buying oil, but providing insurance and financial services that keep the shadow fleet running. Any sign that China is backing away would be devastating for Moscow. I'm not saying that's likely, but it's the scenario that keeps Putin up at night. Watch for 3 things. First, the pace of U.S. naval operations against shadow tankers. Second, any moves by India or China to diversify away from Russian crude. And third, environmental incidents involving shadow fleet vessels, because nothing focuses international attention like an oil spill. Russia built this system to survive sanctions, and for a while it worked brilliantly. But systems have weaknesses, and the U.S. has clearly decided to start exploiting them. The shadow fleet isn't dead yet, but it's definitely taking on water.